Oh, yeah, I'm just going up, yeah. Be here on the end. Yeah. Erica, can you touch your chair a little? Just so we can look at you when you're talking.
Oh, yeah. Oops, sorry.
Sorry. Thank you. So, let's see, I'm passing the mic. You're not passing the mic to me at all, are you? No, you're not. Okay, just use this. I think we use the mic that's here.
No, I think if Erica has a mic, then maybe you and I
You and I can
this one,
share, and you can
and
just
then you
use that.
can
Sure.
share.
Okay. Thanks for coming, Lee Gates.
These here is that going to make a bunch of noise.
Oh, we should be good. And are you managing the?
I'm clicking.
You're the clicker.
I'm a clicker.
So sticking to the plan. Still doing Q&A after each question segment.
It might be more questions from you.
Yeah, I have a bunch. I have a bunch. And thankfully, Maxwell did not eat it, so I wouldn't have to rewrite my notes.
What kind of dog?
Labradoodle. Very rambunctious. I was like, "You're going to daycare today because you have been on 1,000." It's so cute. They sent me videos.
Ready to go?
Yeah.
Ready?
Let's do it.
Terrific. Good afternoon. My name is Roland Anglin. I'm Dean of the College of Public Affairs and Education, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here this afternoon. We have an important topic that we are going to discuss today. Do you know that most of the driver's license in the state of Ohio, that suspended license, are not due to bad driving, reckless driving, speeding, or driving under the influence? Can you guess what it's due to? They're suspended for debt-related suspensions. That's something I've got to find out more about, and I'm eager to hear. This is the finding of a research project that brought together Professor Brian Michelbank at the Legal Aid Society. The project came about because of a pattern legal aid noticed in the community. They gathered data and analyzed both data and experiential experiences to confirm what they had been seeing and document to the degree to which debt-related suspensions were occurring throughout the states. Spoiler, there's a lot of debt-related suspensions in the state of Ohio. But the project is not just learning from data. It's using it to advocate for change in our state. And we're going to learn more about this subject today, but I want to make a point that this is an important example of engaged research. And I'm so happy that Dr. Michelbank and his colleagues today have really partnered to produce this important body of work. I'm going to introduce our moderator, Erica L. Anthony. She's the co-founder and executive director of Cleveland Votes, a nonpartisan democracy-building movement focused on active participation and equitable civic engagement. Erica Anthony is just a treasure in this community, and as you will see, she's a brilliant moderator. She's held positions at Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, Oriana House, and broadly in the legal sector. And she's involved in various boards and civic organizations. Without further ado, Erica Anthony.
Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I forgot we need a mic. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. One major omission, and an alum of this esteemed college here, MPA, represent class 2008. Okay. Not in for that jam, understood. Well, it's an honor to be with you all this afternoon. Again, my name is Erica Anthony. I had the great pleasure of being one of the reviewers of the research that Legal Aid produced and released last year. So it had, early insight into seeing some of the findings. And what I noticed at that time, which you all will hear about today, these statistics are quite sobering. So bear with us as we move through both a lot of qualitative as well as quantitative information as it pertains to what debt-related suspensions are and what we can do about that. So to my immediate left, we have an esteemed panel. Hopefully folks had an opportunity in advance to review their bios. In a moment, I'm going to ask them to provide just a brief introduction because we want to get right into the presentation and conversation for today. So we'll have 4 presenters. In a moment, you'll see on the screen, we have 5 overarching questions that each of the presenters together will be answering and have tons of information and data to support these related topics. These are big picture questions. Obviously, time will not allow for us to go super deep, so I do encourage you to think about how to engage with this esteemed panel after today's conversation, and at the end of the presentation, we will provide everyone's contact information. We want this to be engaging and interactive. Because I know a number of folks in the audience, I will call upon you to ask questions to the folks up here, but I also have a few in the coffers from myself. Again, I think it's important to note that this is a big topic. Not a lot of people are familiar with this topic. I was sharing with the panel just a moment ago that just in conversation with my team this afternoon and telling them about this event, they were intrigued, and so I had an opportunity to educate 2 additional people in our community about what debt-related suspensions are. So that's how we transfer power. That's how we transfer knowledge. We hope that each of you will learn more than one, but maybe just one thing tonight, and then carry that information with you as you continue to be an advocate in the community. So, last thing I'll say before we dive into these questions is it's really important to note that this topic really does transcend ideological and political ideologies, right? We are unfortunately in an era where there's a lot of polarization and politicization as it relates to various topics. We collectively believe that this transcends that, and you'll learn a little bit more as to why that's the case. So just so we are clear on what we're going to cover today, these are the 5 questions. After each question and presentation, we'll have an opportunity to open up the floor for any questions or comments, and then do that for a few minutes, and then we'll move on to the next question. And again, the contact information for everybody will be available at the end of the presentation. So with that said, I'm going to ask each panelist if you can share your name, your pronouns, the organization that you're representing today, and what led you to this work. And we'll start to my immediate left.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ann Sweeney. I'm with the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland. I use she, her pronouns. And I learned about this issue through our clients at Legal Aid who continuously came to Legal Aid looking for help. We realized that while this problem sometimes originates out of criminal legal problems, it quickly becomes a debt issue, one that is often civil in nature, but wasn't squarely in front of the civil legal aid community either at that time. And so people were falling through the cracks without a lot of resource or recourse to resolve debt-related suspensions. Thank you for being here.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Mickelbank. I'm on the faculty here in the college. I came to this project when Ann called me. I have been working on and off with the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland for about 10 years now on various projects, and they're always incredibly interesting and incredibly motivating. It's always data connected to a cause and connected to change, and I've found each of the projects very rewarding to be involved with. Thanks for coming.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joy Carter. I am the network manager at Neighbor Connections, and I was involved in this process by Legal Aid reaching out to us as being partners and engaging in the community, ensuring that communities' voices are informed and involved in this process, and specifically those who've been deeply impacted by this issue. And I'm actually one of those individuals who has been impacted by debt-related driver's license suspension. So this issue really speaks to me both on a personally and professional level.
Hi everyone, my name is Zach Eccles. I'm an attorney with the Ohio Poverty Law Center. I use he, him pronouns. I do a lot of our reentry work, whether it's collateral consequences or record sealing. We also have done work on driver's license reinstatement amnesty, and I came to this issue specifically due to the work of the other panelists up here. Their report is really what shifted our focus at OPLC onto debt-based suspensions. So.
Thank you. So we will start with our first question. What are debt-related suspensions? And you'll see sort of two descriptions on this slide. Debt-related suspensions are a creation of Ohio law. There are numerous reasons in the Ohio statutes for someone to get their driver's license suspended. But when we refer to debt-related suspensions, we're really referring to 5 specific types of suspensions plus 2 registration and warrant blocks. There is also an 8th suspension that no longer exists, but if you've looked at our report, you'll see we did include the random assignment non-compliance suspensions with our report. Those were the suspensions that happened when we all got letters in the mail from the BMV saying, guess what? It's your lucky day. You get to send your proof of insurance to us. And then if you didn't, you ended up with a suspension. That program has been ended, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on that one. But in terms of the laws that create these debt-based suspensions, the license forfeiture statute is a statute that provides for suspensions when somebody fails to pay or fails to appear on a traffic or minor criminal citation. Child support suspensions, as most can infer, are for failure to pay child support. A non-compliant suspension occurs based on the failure to provide proof of insurance. A security suspension is imposed on a driver who's involved in an accident, does not have proof of insurance, and is alleged by the other driver to have caused at least $400 in damage. Then there's the 2 types of blocks, which we think of really as delayed suspensions. The registration block is typically imposed if a defendant fails to pay court fines or fees by the deadline set by the court. And a warrant block is imposed typically when a defendant fails to appear for a case. In both of these instances, the defendant is prevented from renewing their vehicle registration or renewing their driver's license. As you can see on the left-hand side of this slide, debt-related suspensions, or DRS, have significant other impacts on the community. And the data and stories that you will hear about throughout the rest of our panel conversation today will illustrate these realities.
Great. So I'm going to start off just by trying to give us a sense of what the scale of this problem is in the state of Ohio. And we really hate having all these numbers on a single slide because each of them are so impactful. But during our study period, which was from 2016 to 2020, there were over 8 million drivers suspended and over 16 million suspensions. So comparing those two, you could see immediately that it's not unusual for a driver who has a single suspension to have more than one to have to deal with at the same time. Over that time frame, there was over $750 million in new fees and costs charged to these drivers. And in terms of the fees and costs paid, it was over $165 million. At the end of our study period, at the end of 2020, the total amount owed was, again, over $750 million. And just to dwell on that last number a bit, $756 million is the check someone would have to write to the BMV to clear all BMV-related fees so that people could have their license back. It would not touch the court side of things, so it doesn't touch any of the court fees that suspended drivers are also facing. So as we're going through the numbers and the charts and the maps and the stories, and we're thinking, oh, how devastating this is, remember that really this is only part of the picture. That the court part is a separate and equally troublesome part, and we're currently working our way through some Franklin County court data so that we could try to get a handle on that as well. The next slide shows us a statewide map of debt-related suspensions, and this is the rate of suspensions per 1,000 driving age population. So the darker the blue color, the more suspensions there are per 1,000 driving age population. The statewide average is about 300 per 1,000. So 300 per 1,000 across the state. And you can see that the three darker shades of blue are all above that average. And in fact, there are 56 zip codes in the state that have more than one suspension per driving age population for the zip code. There are 56 zip codes that have that condition of more than one suspension per driving age population. If we zoom in just to Cuyahoga County, this is just a quantile map of that same debt-related suspension rate. So it just isolates which zip codes are in the top 20% of debt-related suspension rate, the upper, the middle, the lower, and the bottom rate. I put a few of the rates in there just for comparison. So the top 20% of zip codes in our county, their average DRS rate, their average number of suspensions per 1,000 people is over 1,200. So in that darkest red, the average DRS rate is more than one suspension per driving age person. Just to see the range at the bottom, the lowest DRS rates is less than 60 suspensions per 1,000 people. So the range of less than 60 per thousand to more than 1,200 per thousand shows kind of the variation of this problem within Cuyahoga County. This next slide took us a little bit of time to wrap our mind around. The y-axis is showing the number of suspensions. The blue bar is the number of suspensions to people that do not have a driver's license. And just let that sink in for a second. These are people that do not have a driver's license, but have a suspended driver's license. And you would just think like, oh, that shouldn't even be a thing. Like, why does that even exist, or how does that exist? Well, in our data across our time span, it exists in our data about 12 million times. We have 12 million of those. The red bar, about 4 million drivers, are what we were anticipating. Those are drivers that have a license where the license is suspended. And when we did our public records request to the BMV, that's actually what we were looking for, the red bar. You know, we're like, oh, we're looking for drivers that have their license suspended for reason of a debt-related suspension. And they were like, oh, that's fine. Would you also be interested in these other 12 million records, you know, that are really going through the same thing? And we're like, oh yeah, we'd be pretty interested in those as well. So it was definitely a learning experience along the way. But what's going on in the data is that the state of Ohio considers you unlicensed if you don't have an Ohio license. So you could have a license in another state. You could never have had a license at all in Ohio or any other state. Or what we think is the most likely cause is that drivers had a license and it was suspended. But the suspension lasts so long that your license expires. And you can't renew your license if your license is suspended. So at that moment, you would go from being a driver with a license that is suspended to a driver without a license that happens to be suspended. The extra cherry on top of that scenario is that if your license is expired for more than 6 months, you have to go through the whole process of getting your license again. The written test, the driving test, which I didn't take my driver test here, but I'm sure it somehow involves those orange cones that I see set up in parking lots on the weekend. I don't know what part of that is, but they're always being run over, so I assume that's the difficult part of it. But if you're in that boat, you know, that's what you have to go through. It's this extra burden on top of the suspensions that you have to go through to get your license back. So I guess if there's any good news on this slide, and that's a big if, is that if you're one of the 4 million people in the red bar, your only burden is just to relieve your suspensions. You still have your license. That doesn't have to, you don't have to go through the hassle of also getting your license back. But the people in the blue bar, those 12 million, have that extra burden.
And I could just talk.
Hello? Okay. Can you guys hear me? I could just talk about just some of the stories I've heard, working in the community and spreading awareness about this issue. One story that kind of stood out, that really breaks my heart, is specifically around a young couple that I met over the summer. And this issue was impacting two individuals who live in the Outhwaite housing in the central neighborhood, and they both are impacted by debt-related driver's license suspension. So imagine a household of two, head of household, a mother and father, who's impacted by this issue. So not only does it affect you as an individual, but it affects your family and being able to provide for your family. So for instance, the gentleman that I met, like what Brian mentioned, he got his license suspended before he was even able to get his license. He had a situation on the bus when he was a teenager. He got into a physical altercation, which prohibited him from getting his license. And that happened so long ago. He's now in his mid-20s, and to this day, he still does not have his license. His fiance, she had a traffic ticket. She wasn't able to pay the fees and fines to get her license. And both together, they weren't able to keep a job long enough. They were both losing jobs because they couldn't get to work. They both have two young children, one toddler and one newborn. So they imagine, taking the two young children on the bus to childcare, or trying to find childcare within walking distance, or even, taking the newborn to their doctor's appointments. These are things that they're telling me that they can't really do. It's impossible. And also just between the both of them, the debt that they've acquired, and not being able to have the extra income to pay that debt on top of the bills that they have to pay. And one thing that I will never forget is the look that the young man gave me when he said, "I can't provide for my children because of this issue. I'm not able to be a father." And that's something that stuck with me, and that's something that why I do this work, because this is something that's impacting his livelihood, is stripping his human rights away just to be able to provide. And that story is something that always sticks with me.
All right, remember what I said in the beginning? Microphone check, okay. Remember what I said in the beginning? We would come to a place where you all would be able to ask questions. I think there's somebody in the audience, I'm looking around, that may have a mic. So I'll give you folks a moment to collect your thoughts. I will start with a question to give you just a little bit more time to think about your question or your comment. And then we would ask that you come up to the mic. This is being recorded, so we want to make sure that we are able to capture your question. So I'm going to start with Anne. So, according to the report that came out now a little over a year ago, September of 2022, and then subsequent investigative report by Marshall Project and others, there was a data point that stood out to me particularly, and that is that Ohio is one of 23 states that suspends licenses for failure to pay fees and fines, and that we are an outlier in the region. Can you talk a little bit more about why you believe that's the case? And we'll get to later as to the things that we're doing, but at least right now, why is Ohio an outlier compared to some of our counterparts in this region?
Well, that is a great question. I would love some of our decision makers to help answer this, but I suspect one of the reasons is that fines and fees became a source of revenue for local courts and local government. And so this, I think, was a pretty typical policy decision to use it as a way to both incentivize, or I think the thought process behind it is that it would both incentivize litigants to appear and to resolve their issues in front of the court, and it will also then generate operating revenue for the courts. And I think the question is still unanswered as to how effectively it achieves that purpose.
Thank you for your response. And then I would just open, and Zach, you may be able to answer this question. When we think about some of the surrounding states, or even states that maybe have recently changed their laws, is there a positive example that you can think of that Ohio may glean from and learn from?
Yeah, so it's not a very close state, but New Mexico just passed a law recently that really makes a lot of the changes that we'd like to see here in Ohio. And, you know, this is an issue that I don't think we should take the successes of other states around us as, you know, a bad sign that why are we so far behind, because there is a national trend of states really examining and taking this issue seriously and starting to take action on it. And I think that's just starting to happen here in Ohio, thanks a lot to the work that some of these panelists have done. But it is a trend that's going across the country.
Thank you. And what is the name of that national org, in case folks are not familiar?
So no, it's just states across the country, the national trend.
Oh, okay. I thought there was a specific org.
But there are multiple organizations that are working on it. I mean, Fines and Fees Justice Center is a national organization that we partner with on this issue. And they specifically deal with fines and fees in the criminal legal system, as evidenced by their name. But, you know, a lot of different organizations like the conservative think tank ALEC, for example, Americans for Prosperity, ACLU, like you mentioned at the start of the panel, it is not an ideologically driven issue necessarily, so you get a lot of actors on both sides of the aisle that are really looking at this issue for what it is, and I don't want to say it's low-hanging fruit, but seeing it as something that both sides would be willing to work on and can meaningfully impact people's lives for the better.
Thank you. Looking to see if we have any questions in the audience.
My first question is, what other two states basically have the same DRS over their heads? What other two states? Do you know?
Can you repeat? I can't hear the last part. Can you repeat the question?
What I heard
What-
is, are
what
there
other
other
two
states that
states?
have the same
Right,
number?
right. Well, the same law.
So almost every state, about half of the states, still continue to suspend driver's license for failure to pay court fines and failure to appear in court. There's about half of the states that have made some amount of changes to their laws to limit when people can lose their license for failure to pay or failure to appear.
Okay. Have the states realized that it creates a economic deficit for this DRS?
So I think the headline is, we recognize that.
Right.
And what we'll get to in some of the other questions, we'll dig into some of the financial impacts. So I'm gonna, unless Zach, you have something, I know Brian's gonna cover some of the financial impact.
Yeah.
Or, I'm sorry, you are, my apologies.
I'll just add really quickly that states are waking up to it, but you know, with that slide that Ann showed earlier, there are a lot of different types of debt-based suspensions. So when you're talking about failure to pay a court fine or failure to appear, how you address that and the reasons for why you address it are very different from how you address like default and child support suspensions.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Ronnie Dunn. I'm an associate professor of urban studies here in the College of Urban Affairs. And this is the first I've heard of this project, but I must say I was taken aback when I saw the title and the subject matter, because I did research on this back in my dissertation in 2004 on racial profiling, and this was one of the significant findings, the disproportionate rate at which blacks in particular were cited for driving under suspension. And I've replicated that study on a number of occasions, most recently in 2010, I think, for Bill Mason when he commissioned a study on the use of police discretion. So I'm pleased to hear that you're advancing this work, but I was once again surprised to hear that this forum was taking place, and I'm like, what? Are they aware of my research on this issue? So it's not a new finding. I commend you for looking at it at the state level, but I saw in your slides where, Brian, you showed the darker colors, particularly in Cuyahoga County in the city of Cleveland, and they were concentrated on the eastern side of the city, as we know how the city's racially segregated. So can you talk about the racial implications of your findings in this work?
It probably won't surprise you, we have a few slides coming up on that, but it is as you would anticipate, that the debt-related suspensions are heavily concentrated in communities of color. And to your research, since I was on your committee, I think, there's definitely a piece of this is the policing part. And I think that particularly comes up in the degree to which these suspensions linger, when your license is suspended initially, how long the suspension lasts is often a function of your interaction with law enforcement while you have that initial suspension. And since that is higher in communities of color, that other research, we don't have data on this in our data, shows that suspensions are longer in those conditions.
Thank you for your question, Dr. Dunn. All right, we're going to move on to our second question, and I'm going to turn it over to Zach.
Yeah, so to answer this question, I think we have to start with what we're trying to accomplish with debt-related suspensions. And at their most basic form, they're really just an overextension of the criminal legal system. I think when most people think about a driver's license suspension, they don't know about debt-related suspensions, right? They think you are speeding too many times and get a bunch of points on your driver's license, so you get your driver's license suspended. And in that scenario, it makes sense, right? Because you're taking, the primary reason why we incarcerate people, for example, is the hope that our criminal legal system relies on this, the hope that that threat of incarceration will deter people from acting badly in the future. And if it doesn't, then we incarcerate them and immediately stop the bad behavior, right? That works in theory for something like speeding, but doesn't translate to not being able to pay a court fine. You can't deter someone from not being able to afford a fine or fee like you theoretically can with speeding. So once we start to use driver's license suspensions to collect debt, it kind of starts to spiral. So, another reason for these suspensions is to not only deter future behavior, but to restrict future behavior. And you see this a lot for unruly child or delinquency suspensions, the idea that if this child can't drive anymore, they'll go to school every day instead of doing whatever else it is they're doing. For child support default suspensions, you probably can't pay your child support because you're spending all of your time doing something else that you shouldn't be doing instead of going to work, right? So these presumptions that we build into the law don't always reflect reality, and also create a pathway for us to go further and further from the original purpose of the suspension to then you get to the point where we have judgment suspensions and security suspensions where these suspensions have become such a tool for debt collection that now we're allowing private companies and private individuals to use the BMV to collect their debts. And then also we have our courts, Ann mentioned earlier, are fairly reliant, especially our rural courts, are reliant on a lot of the collection of fees for their own operating. So they have also used driver's license suspensions as a tool of debt collection. And that shift has really created harsh realities for a lot of people.
Great. So for this slide, we're focusing just on the financial aspects of debt-related suspensions, and just for 1 year, just for the last year of our data, 2020. There's a few things I want to draw our attention to here. First, along the x-axis, we have the amount owed at the end of 2020, and then the amounts, new amounts that were charged and the amounts that were paid in that same year, 2020. We're distinguishing in the red and the blue whether the source of the funds is to a third party, which is usually insurance companies, or whether it's to the BMV. So the third parties are in red, BMV is in blue. So the first point, first thing we want to notice from the graph is that most debt goes unpaid. So if we're looking on the left, either the red bar or the blue bar, they're the tallest, right? They have the most money. The $756 million that was owed at the end of 2020 from the previous slide, that's the sum of the leftmost red and blue bar. So even amongst all the different nuances in the data and the different things that we're going to talk about today around debt-related suspensions, a primary message is that most of them go unpaid. So when we think about kind of the disruption that they cause and the infrastructure that's built up around them, most of these charges are going unpaid. That every year there's more charged than actually gets paid. So it just accumulates over time, and you could see that in the graph. Two, the second point is that most of the funds owed that is keeping people from their licenses is owed to third parties, not the BMV. So in the owed column on the left, that red bar of about $600 million is much taller than the blue bar that's due to the BMV. And the third party activity, both in the amounts owed and the amounts charged, and this is our last point for this slide, is greater for the third party aspect of this problem than the BMV part of this problem. So that puts the BMV in this awkward position of being a debt collector or even a debt motivator, debt collection motivator, to try to collect this debt that's not owed to them but owed to a third party, but they're withholding your state license until that private debt is paid. So it's an awkward setup for a state agency to be in, to be holding your license until you pay this debt to a third party.
All right, y'all. Your turn again. I will start with a brief question, and I think maybe this may be too simple of a question, but I know for Brian and Zach, when I was reviewing the slide deck in preparation, and particularly the slide on this data, in my mind, simplicity, is how I'd like to operate. I said to myself, when I think about that column, that one, bar on the graph, where obviously there's much more owed than what is actually being collected, I also started to question what is the administrative costs associated, right? So this is what is like actually owed. But like you just said a moment ago, right, there's infrastructure, there are staff people, there is, processes that have to go behind this. I think to me, not this slide alone, but this is definitely one of those slides that would, to me, justify why we need to change, the policies related to DRSs.
Specifically on the third party, if you look at the $600 million owed, and then look at that little thin slice of red of what actually gets paid, it was only about 1% of that. And I don't know kind of what what a standard collection agency would bring in on debt, but it seems like it's causing a lot of disruption in people's lives to collect 1% of that $600 million every year.
Right, and I think going back to Joy's example earlier, and I know we'll hear more soon, the ramifications, right, and particularly in the example that Joy provided with two persons under the same household being impacted, right? It's not just about what is owed, but what does that look like as it relates to your workforce opportunities, your ability to provide for your family. So again, I think it's important to elevate here why it's both a quantitative, we need both the quantitative data as well as the qualitative data to really illustrate why this is such a hardship, for folks here in the state. Question over here?
I'm questioning whether the citations or the tickets basically include, like Dr. Ronnie was saying, he basically did a study, and I think it was on the red light
Traffic
tickets,
jams.
which were, if I remember correctly, they were summoned to be illegal. So are they still basically being, for those who basically were cited for those red light tickets, are they still basically being held with no driver's license because of that?
That's a great question, because I tell
Yeah.
you, when I moved to Ohio, y'all got me good those first couple months. I was not aware of those traffic cams. But we'll turn to my left to answer this question.
That was a problem.
All right, so someone can correct me if I get this wrong, but I'm pretty sure that at this point, the traffic cameras can only be enforced through civil penalties. So yes, you're still gonna get a fee, but you're not gonna see the same spiraling criminal fines and fees that we're talking about in terms of the failure to pay and failure to appear.
Thank you.
To know how much of the unpaid debt gets discharged in bankruptcy, and what's the effect on credit for those people that get their licenses suspended?
We also want to know that answer to that question. So I'm sorry, I don't have data on that unless somebody did more research that I'm not aware of. But I will tell you that at Legal Aid, unfortunately, bankruptcy is one of our options of last resort for our clients who come in with debt-related suspensions. We had one scenario in which a woman was facing a suspension actually for the unauthorized use of her vehicle by somebody else. And she did have insurance, but it didn't cover the unauthorized use by the other person, which triggered both a security suspension, a non-compliance suspension. It then actually led to a potential eviction because, as we explained earlier, she couldn't renew her vehicle registration, and having expired tags on the vehicle parked at your apartment was a lease violation. So through a series of really unfortunate escalating problems, ultimately she resorted to bankruptcy, and it was the only way to get her out from that, that penalty.
Thank you all for your questions. We're going to move on to our third question. Who is impacted by debt-related suspensions and how?
So our first answer for this is high poverty communities. And to construct this graph, we took all the zip codes in Ohio, about 1,200 of them, and we divided them into 10 groups based on their poverty rate. So the short bar all the way over on the left, those are the lowest poverty zip codes in the state. Their poverty rate is about 1%. The tall bar all the way over on the right, those are the 120 zip codes that have the highest poverty rates in the state, and their poverty rate is about 40% on average. The height of each bar is not the poverty rate. The height of each bar is actually the number of suspensions in each group of zip codes. So in the leftmost bar, that group of zip codes that had the 1% poverty rate, they have about 130,000 debt-related suspensions. And if that was the only number I told you today, I think we would all agree that sounds horrible. Right? We'd be like, oh, today I'm going to tell you about 120 zip codes that have 130,000 debt-related suspensions, and we'd be like, well, what do we do about this? But it turns out that's like the best news on this slide. When we go all the way over to the right, the high poverty zip codes, the ones with the 40% poverty, they had about 5.1 million debt-related suspensions. So the high poverty zip codes had 40 times the debt-related suspensions of the low poverty zip codes. The next thing we were curious about is how this intersected with race. So we matched this again to ACS data. We've defined our communities of color as the percent of the population that are not non-Hispanic white. We constructed this graph in the same way. Same 1,200 zip codes, divided them into 10 categories based on their percent people of color. The percent people of color in the tiny little blue bar all the way over on the left is about 0. Those are Ohio's whitest zip codes. The percent people of color in the tallest bar all the way over on the right is about 60%. And we wanted to see, well, how many of these debt-related suspensions fall within these different people of color zip codes. All the way on the left-hand side, about 52,000 debt-related suspensions in the whitest zip codes in the state, 52,000. In the Zip codes with the highest percent people of color, all the way over on the right, almost 7 million. So the difference between the whitest zip codes and the zip codes with the highest percent people of color is about 130 times more debt-related suspensions. So these patterns were really clear in our data in terms of how the debt-related suspensions are interacting with poverty and race. This is yours.
Okay, and I'm going to talk about the basic needs and how it's affecting individuals who are impacted by this issue. So I can talk about, one, employment. We know that a lot of employers, when it comes to hiring employees, a lot of them require you to have a valid driver's license, even if you're not required to operate a vehicle. And even to travel to get to some of these jobs that are livable wage job or a tad bit above minimum wage, these jobs are in the suburb or outer ring suburbs. So if you live in communities like East Cleveland or Huff, the commute to get to these jobs by car can be 30 to 45 minutes. And if you live in a city like Cleveland, where our public transit is not reliable, it's not accessible, you have to take maybe 3 or 4 buses just to get to one job, that commute could be 3 hours. On top of if you have children where you have to take them to childcare, or if you're physically impaired, or if there's weather conditions. We all know how harsh our Cleveland weathers are. These are all things that pay an effect and impacts people's regular route just to get to work. The 44104 zip code that I've been able to receive stories within the zip code are neighborhoods of impoverished individuals where there's food deserts. There are not a lot of access to quality foods or grocery stores. If you do have a grocery store within your neighborhood, it's 5 to 10 miles via car. So imagine being an individual like the story I told earlier, where you're trying to get your groceries and get diapers and get formula and go to your pharmacy to get your medicine. And if you have an elder in your home where you have to get them to their doctor's appointments, this is something that's impacting your route every day. This is something you gotta do every day, regardless of how you feel if you're sick. This is something that is just detrimental to a lot of individuals. And I also lastly want to talk about the mental and the physical impact on individuals who are going through this. Physically, it's impacting people because if you have underlying ailments, if you're, you have arthritis, if you're a senior, imagine walking around to and from the different spaces where you have to get to work or to go to grocery stores, or just the trouble it is just to commute or just to get to public transit. Buses aren't just at your door. Sometimes you have to walk a couple blocks to get to the nearest bus stop. I mean, this is the physical ailments that affects people, and then the mental ailments is chronic stress. How I'm gonna get through my day, how I'm gonna scramble and get the money to pay for this bus today. I'm stressful because my kids are crying and I'm trying to get them to work and still keep a level head and still do what I have to do, but also how people view themselves being impacted by this. I mean, a couple people that I talked to, they talked about how they feel like they're a burden when they have to ask for a ride, or they feel embarrassed when they have to explain that, hey, this is my 3rd job I lost in the last 6 months because I can't get to work. Or I'm sorry that I missed your event, but I can't get to your event because I have to take 3 buses just to get there. So it plays a toll on people. People feel like they're inadequate. They feel like they're let people down. They feel like they're not a good example or a reliable adult. And ultimately, they feel like they're a statistic. And that's just something that, plays a toll. And those are just some of the impacts that I've heard and some of the stories that I've heard in some of my conversations that I've had in the community.
And then based on this work that Joy's been doing, it really got us thinking about the way that a debt-related suspension really impacts so many other parts of your life. And we started to think about, well, how can we start to understand that? What data could we try to use to understand that issue? So we dipped into the United Way 211 call for help data. And these are just for Cuyahoga County. And United Way was great in both sharing their data and helping us understand the nuances in the data. And we decided to look at, they track a category called basic needs calls. And these are calls for food, housing, transportation, utilities, or material goods. And they track those as a category. So learning from those outreach stories, we thought, well, we wonder how those basic needs calls to 211 are distributed across, related to the debt-related suspensions. So on the y-axis here, we just divided the zip codes in Cuyahoga County into these 5 groups again, based on their debt-related suspension rate. So at the top is the zip codes in the county that have the highest debt-related suspension rate, and the bottom is the lowest DRS rate. And we could see that the size of the bars is the number of calls for basic needs in those zip codes. So the zip codes that have the highest DRS rates are getting the most, about 350,000 needs 211 calls for this basic needs category. And you can see the higher the DRS rate, the higher the number of calls that are originating from there for these basic needs calls. And this is another pattern that was pretty clear in the various iterations of the 211 data we looked at. This is my last data slide. So I just wanted to make one final point. We have a ton of data on this. And I could show you these maps and graphs all day, and they all look like this. It would probably make for a pretty terrible forum event. I would like it, but maybe not too many other people. And it's these patterns that we repeatedly see. So it is not the case that the 7 or 8 graphs that we show today are kind of the only ones that demonstrate this point. Everything that we've looked at demonstrates this point. And it's going to pain me a little bit as a generally positive person to end my participation on such a downer. But we are yet to ask a question of these data that doesn't have a terrible answer.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Joy. Let's take a collective breath, y'all. It's a lot. No one issue is isolated. When I see the 211 data, I'm brought back to 2020, right? When we all unfortunately share a bond of experiencing COVID. And I remember pretty early on, United Way talking about the shifts in where calls were coming from, right? So we know, unfortunately, where there's, deep poverty, particularly here in the city of Cleveland, right? But seeing those shifts of folks having basic need requests and asks, whether it's for food or housing, right? So we know that this issue of debt-related suspensions does not happen in isolation. And Joy and Brian, both just highlighted, a number of ways that individuals are already put at a disadvantage by virtue of the zip code that they represent. Joy, just to make sure that everyone that's listening and participating today, where is 44104 in the city of Cleveland?
So that is the central neighborhood, and specifically some of the stories I recorded was in the Outhwaite housing projects. So that was some of the data that I received and conversations that I've had with Ms. Hope and some of her neighbors.
Thank you. And I think another fact about the central neighborhood, it also holds the highest percentage of public housing here in the city of Cleveland. So again, when we think about some of the statistics and some of the information that Joy and subsequently Brian in the 211 graph, we know again that folks are already in a disadvantaged place. So I'm looking around to see if there's a question. If not, I have one for the crew here. So when I see this information and hear the stories that Joy has shared, it seems pretty obvious that the bat signal should be up in the air, right? We should be ringing every alarm. Why don't more people know about this? And this is sort of an open-ended question for everyone listening and participating today, which I know we'll get to more solutions, but just some initial thoughts about how do we elevate this?
Okay. So we're going to talk more about this actually a little later, but I would say that as far as people not knowing about it, I don't think people know that this is something that should be resolved. When people think about debt-related driver's license suspension, I don't think people realize it's such a big issue until they're in the room with other people who've been impacted by the issue. And then when you hear people, and you hear the data like this, and you talk, and you're like, wow, this is happening across Ohio. This is happening to millions of Ohioans. This is bigger than what I can even imagine. I think some people don't think that their voice matter. That's why I advocate storytelling so much, because you can use your story as an advocate, or to be an advocate and as a catalyst for change. You can use your story to influence. You can use your story to be empowered. That is not a thing that we're just saying. That is a real way of which you can speak truth to power. A lot of these stories is how we're able to, you know, you need the data, but at the same time, you need the real life examples. We have an advisory council that I'm going to talk more about that is individuals who have been impacted by this issue, who's still going through this issue, and they're raising their questions and they want their voices and their input on some of these bills that are being, you know, mentioned. So we have to have people who've been impacted by this issue be involved from the start of the conversations to the legislation to the meetings that we're having. And I'm going to talk more about what that looks like, but as far as awareness, I don't think people realize this is something that needs to be changed. And I think when you get in the room and you realize it's not just affecting me, it's affecting my family, then the conversation starts to get a little bit more serious, I say.
Thank you, Joy. And I just want to double back to one of your points earlier about the mental health impact as well,
Yeah.
right? There's obviously a clear argument for the financial impact, but even as you just, you know, noted, this doesn't just impact the individual who has that suspended driver's license, right? If they have a spouse, if they have a partner, if they're the caregiver, you know, for a loved one, a child, right? So the collateral damage, unfortunately, you know, transcends beyond that one individual.
I would add to my answer would pretty much be the opposite of Joy's. You know, and I think that's one of the nice things of working with this group is that that we could focus on that I could focus on the data, and we also have Joy focusing on the storytelling, and it puts together like this really compelling narrative about what's going on that really speaks across both spectrums.
Yeah, I'll just add, I also think education is a really big part of this. You know, in the meetings I have with legislators, most of them have no idea what debt-related suspensions are and have never heard of them before and have no idea the impact that they're having on real-life people. And not too surprisingly, most of the times when you explain to them what this issue is, people agree that we should do something about this. But I think education is really, really a big part of it, and yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. All right. Our second to last question is, why are debt-related suspensions so difficult to resolve?
So I got that one. So what we've heard from the community is that regardless of how hard you try and the efforts that you make, it is difficult to get yourself out of this situation. No matter what you do, you can try as much as you can. You can try to pay on it, do payments. It's still a trap. It's still hard to navigate through the system. It's still barriers attached to this problem. And it's daunting. It's challenging. You feel exhausted trying and trying and trying. And it just continues to perpetuate the cycle of poverty. And pointing example is that if you're can't pay child support and you're punishing me by removing my license, then that ultimately means I can't pay my child support because I have no way to get to work. That is hurting me more than it is helping me. So what is the goal here at the end of the day? I think when it comes to this issue, people tend to choose one necessity over the other. I'm going to risk my freedom because I need to do what I need to do for my family, even though it might not be the best interest for me or of me. But I have to get to work, and this is not, like I said, it's not a city where public transit is the best. So I'm going to risk my freedom by driving because I have no other option, and that's how people feel. They feel like their back is against the wall, and that they're trapped, and they don't know how to get out of it. Miss Hope, whom I mentioned earlier, she's a woman who her license was suspended at 19. She is now 50 years old and still dealing with this issue. So this is a thing it's affecting her, and it's been affecting her throughout her entire adult life. So it keeps you trapped literally, and people have to do what they have to do, and unfortunately we don't want people to do those things, but with drastic measures, people tend to do it regardless if it's something that they feel is the best for them. So that's what I've been hearing from the community.
And that reality from those stories definitely matches with the law, unfortunately. There's not a straightforward solution for people. Well-intentioned, well-meaning folks who really want to get these suspensions sorted out so that they can be free from the debt burden and driving lawfully are jumping through numerous hoops for extended periods of time in order to resolve their suspensions. So, for example, we tried to assist people at Legal Aid who face debt-related suspensions. We also tried to put together some self-help material, some community education material that would give direction to folks who want to get their suspensions resolved on their own. And as we attempted to put that information together, it quickly grew to like a more than 10-page document, which was not realistic or going to be particularly helpful. So we took a step back and tried to think, well, what can we offer that is at least some help, gives folks some direction. We have a flyer on the table today, it's on our website, that walks folks through a very simple roadmap of looking up their driving record, figuring out what type of suspensions they have so they know what they owe, perhaps being able to request driving privileges, and of course getting insurance. So there are 4 steps. They are not easy to accomplish, is what I'm trying to emphasize, depending on your circumstances. Below the link to that document are several examples of options that are available in some situations, for some people, for some suspensions, but not one solution exists across the board for these debt-related suspensions. So, you know, whether somebody can get on a payment plan with the BMV, whether somebody can get on a payment plan with the court, whether someone qualifies for community service in lieu of their fines and fees, or potentially could ask a court to waive their fines and fees, are certainly all options. Also, Ohio has an amnesty program that I think Zach will talk about. So there are some options available, but with, on average, a person with a suspension having more than one, navigating the steps necessary to get it resolved is really a long-term, complicated process.
We need to bring up the energy in this room. Woo-wee! Very heavy conversation. This is kind of maybe an off-the-wall question, but I think it's worth asking. You know, who are some unlikely co-conspirators, right? When I think about each of you on this panel and making an assumption based upon attendance here, you know, folks' interests, you know, you might think of policy folks, attorneys, you know, community advocates, organizers, you know, these are folks that would have a rightful interest, but who else should we be talking to perhaps help to elevate this conversation?
Definitely your senators.
Senator?
I-
Yes, for sure.
And another, so another surprising one is law enforcement officers. We had hearings months ago on House Bill 29, which seeks to reduce suspensions for default on child support. And there were 2 Republican representatives in the committee that were asking the sponsors, you know, why is this so limited? Why can't we get this bill to do more? Because when they were in law enforcement, they got very, very tired of constantly having to pull people over who had suspensions for administrative reasons, these debt-based reasons. You know, that 1, wastes their time, and 2, every traffic stop for them is a risk. So this is one of those rare issues where I think law enforcement and community organizers might have a lot more common ground than compared to most other issues.
Thanks, Zach. Any other responses? Any questions?
With all this great information that you all have brought forth, do we have a policy person in urban that can basically place a change in the process of this DRS?
I don't think any of us know the question or the answer to that question, a
Yeah.
specific person.
Right.
We are in a moment going to talk a little bit about, some pathways,
Okay,
but hold on to that.
Sorry.
okay.
All right, so our final question for this evening is, what is Ohio doing about DRS? It's like you had our slide deck in advance somehow and/or creeping over here on the podium. So I will turn it over, I think, first to Zach.
Yeah, and so with this slide, you can see that national trend that I was talking about earlier. Since 2017, 24 states have enacted laws to eliminate suspensions for failure to pay or failure to appear, or some degree of that. And like I mentioned, with your child support, default suspensions, judgment suspensions, security suspensions, there's a lot of nuance in how you tackle each one of those, and states tackle them to different degrees all the time. So 24 since 2017, but 12 of those have been enacted since 2021. And we are really hoping that Ohio will be one of the next. Ann mentioned the driver's license reinstatement fee amnesty program. That was first a pilot program in 2019 and then became a permanent program in 2020. So it creates a pathway for people to have their reinstatement fees either partially forgiven or completely waived, with, of course, a few very important catches. So to get a reduction of your reinstatement, and sorry, I should back up 1 second. The reinstatement fees are fees that you pay to the BMV after your license has been suspended and you've completed all the conditions of your suspension as an administrative fee to the BMV to get your license back. It's separate from court costs and court fees, okay? So just the reinstatement fees is what we're talking about here. In order to get a reduction through the BMV program, your suspension has to have run and then 18 months has to have gone by and you still haven't had your driver's license reinstated yet. So there's no means testing or income qualification for that, but if you have a year-long suspension, you're going to have to wait 2.5 years if you can't afford your reinstatement fees before you're eligible for a reduction under the program. You can get a full waiver of your reinstatement fees if you're income eligible, but there's no direct means testing. They determine income eligibility through participation in other programs like OWF, Veterans Pension, and then a couple other that I'm forgetting, which runs into its own issues because you could be income eligible, but for other reasons not be eligible for any of those programs. Now, all those caveats aside, the program has helped a lot of people. We did a study of it over the first 2 years, and 222,716 Ohioans received either a waiver or full reduction, or waiver or reduction of their reinstatement fees, and the average program participant saved $612 in reinstatement fees. And then people who received just the reduction, I think it was 78% paid the remaining amount of their reinstatement fees to BMV and went on to get their license reinstated. That resulted in the BMV collecting $23 million in reinstatement fees over 2 years. So that's just very clear evidence to me that the high fees are the burden. And once you reduce or remove those, people will take action to get their driver's license back. Something else that we've done just recently in the budget that we passed, the state budget that was passed in July, reduced non-compliance suspension reinstatement fees, the first time offense, from $100 to $40, which is a really big step because those non-compliance reinstatement fees are the ones that really stack up very quickly. The House and the Senate passed their versions of the budget that reduced all noncompliance reinstatement fees to $40, but Governor DeWine vetoed that, so we're still stuck with second offense reinstatement fees being $300 and third offense reinstatement fees being $600. And then we are also still working on Senate Bill 37. That's kind of the primary legislative vehicle in place right now to undo some of the damage that these debt-related suspensions have done. Senate Bill 37 is sponsored by Senator Blessing and Senator Ingram, both from the Cincinnati area. It is bipartisan legislation, and we think will hopefully go a really, really long way to prevent debt-related suspensions from being such a huge problem in Ohio moving forward. You can't eliminate child support default suspensions entirely. There are federal funding requirements tied to having that available as an option, but you can increase the availability of limited driving privileges. This is a separate conversation, but Senate Bill 37 in its current form, and hopefully it will be amended soon, we'll also do some work on reducing the availability of driver's license suspensions for drug possession charges. So we really want to limit driver's license suspensions in Ohio to dangerous driving, and hopefully, after a lot of work, Senate Bill 37 will get us closer to that goal.
And I can speak more too about what Neighborhood Connections is doing with our Drive to Justice work. So Drive to Justice is pretty much our engagement efforts is to spreading awareness with the community, but more so, like I said earlier, as a way of which people can use their story and their testimony of how they've been impacted by this issue as a way to enforce change. So here we had our neighborhood drivers advocacy training where we were able to help people and teach people to how they can use their story specifically to as a way of messaging, your own individual messaging around this issue and how you can be an advocate. So what values are being attacked when you're talking about your issue and how anyone can listen to your story and relate to you. I think some people struggle with that where they think, oh, my story is my story and no one else can relate, but we're teaching people where you can be a campaign, you can kind of speak and be like a campaign leader and be a lobbyist with your story. You don't have to limit your story and think you can only speak to people who are in your neighborhood. You can also speak to legislators, and we're giving people, the platform and building their confidence knowing that they can use their story as a way to advocate for change. And this is people who have been impacted by the issue. Even this little gentleman in the corner here, he gave a lot of great suggestions too. So this is also a call to action. So if any of you feel compelled and want to be involved in this Drive to Justice work, please let me know. You will be paid a stipend for your time, but we need as many as possible to kind of move this work forward. And ultimately what the community wants, they want to end this. They want to end debt-related driver's license suspension. They want to work with legislators and talk to law enforcement, come up with solutions together that's equitable. It's not a thing where we're against anyone. We want to be able to understand why and what is the reason. Like myself, I was impacted by this issue. My license was suspended after a speeding ticket and failure to pay in court. And I didn't even know my license was suspended. I was driving for months without it. So even education around checking your status of your license, that like the one pager that we have here. Now that I'm doing this work, I know these resources are available, but I know so many others might not know or be privy to this information. So, continue to think, let us know, what are some places we can drop these flyers off, or what are some advertisements we can put this in so that people can have more access to this information. So as far as what we're doing, what the community want, they want to join advisory committees, they want to be on rallies, they want to be a part of campaigns, they want their story to be heard, they want to talk to legislators face to face. They want to be out there. They want to fight. So that's what we're doing.
All right. Well, we are at the final stage of our forum. Any other comments or questions for our panelists? Yes, ma'am.
On the
Joy.
end, your point with regard to the people who were able to get reductions in fees and amnesty, did any of you figure out of the big list of the unpaid 6 million, how many of those people might be eligible for the reduction but not know it and need help making those connections?
So we don't have an exact number for that. One of the good things about the reinstatement fee amnesty program is that once you become eligible for a reduction, the BMV is required to send you a notice of eligibility. But we don't have that same requirement for waiver eligibility because, like I said, that you don't have that 18-month waiting period for that. You're eligible right away if you're in getting benefits from one of those programs, but the BMV doesn't have the ability to talk to Job and Family Services or whoever else is administering the program to cross-check and see who's eligible or not. So we don't really either. But the waivers are where most of the money is being left on the table, probably because people just don't know that they're eligible for it. No, they are. The reduction, so I'm saying they're getting notices for the reduction, not the complete waiver, yeah.
And we would have loved to be able to tell that from our data that we have, but the data that we received from the BMV was all by zip code. So it didn't have any individual attributes attached to it.
But I do think, part of, and, Joy just said this in her remarks about, receiving recommendations, right? We do have the zip codes. We do have at least a geographical understanding. And so, from my lens and perspective and the work I do with Cleveland Votes and in other capacities, it's always about being proximate, right, to those that are most impacted. And, some of that entails us not necessarily going to the institutions, but going to where the people are going, right? Going to the corner stores, going to the grocery stores, going to the rec centers, right? So I think receiving those type of recommendations, if you are, someone that works in the community, to say, well, I know there's a lot of traffic, like I'll just use an example, 40th and Quincy, right? I know that gas station gets tremendous amount of traffic, right? That could be a place where we may want to have a flyer. So just thinking creatively about how to get this information out, because what a shame, that these programs are available, but we're not educating the public at large how to access them.
So one other challenge is that the BMV sends notices to the last address on file with the BMV. So I point that out both because I think it's a consideration in terms of the uptake and use of the amnesty program, but it is also one of the reasons people end up with suspensions and don't know about it because it's going to the last address, not the current address.
Zach, I had a question, and apologies if you said this. For the amnesty program, what is the cadence or the frequency? Is that something that happens county by county? Like where does it happen and how often does it happen?
So that's not something that we looked at in our report, but I think it would be kind of safe to assume that it would mirror a lot of the findings that Road to Nowhere report found and where the highest percentage of debt-related suspensions are. The average reduction for a program participant was $612. It is insane that someone would have $612 to even be reduced in the first place, right? So I would expect where the highest DRS is also where you'd hopefully get the highest participation in the amnesty program.
And then, Anne, I know unfortunately there's not a legal aid in every jurisdiction across the state of Ohio. Well, every nook and cranny of the city, of the state. So, when you think about an entry door for people to at least begin their knowledge and education around what they can do, whether they're here, is coming to legal aid a good starting place? And then if you're not here in Cuyahoga County, perhaps folks have family or friends outside of this county, where would be a good place to start to, amend this process?
So unfortunately, as we talked about, right, it's a complicated process, but for folks who can start to tackle resolving their suspensions. I think looking up their driving record is honestly the starting point. That can be done from the BMV website. The driving abstract will give a list of the types of suspensions and the amounts owed, and a little bit more about what the parameters are. So that is one important step. Another is for anything related to court appearances, you generally speaking have to go back to the court where that offense occurred, whether it's to get on a payment plan, whether it's to get a new court date. There's not really a workaround, and for a lot of very understandable reasons, people can be reluctant to do that, but the only alternative to that is some communities have started to offer what are often called clinics or license reinstatement or record sealing and license events where they bring together clerks of courts, muni judges, sometimes child support, sometimes job and family services, and they try to create a one-stop shop option that includes the BMV where individuals can make progress in that one event with getting several steps taken care of in the process. Cleveland has offered some of those. I know Columbus has one coming up, I think. Do you know the date off the top of your head, Beth?
October 24th.
I'm not sure whether Cincinnati does, but keeping an eye out for those types of events would be another option.
We have a question over here.
This is a compelling body of work and a compelling project. I just wonder, do you have plans to continue monitoring the situations and putting pressure on public policy to change?
I mean, yeah, we still have a lot of work to do to get to the point where we're monitoring implementation, but anytime you try to advance a policy change, you have to follow it up with monitoring the implementation of that change, right? And I know this will be a multiple years long project for OPLC at least.
So,
Please.
I was just going to elaborate that and clarify some of the relationships. So Zach is with the Ohio Poverty Law Center. They do a lot of the lobbying work. I'm with a legal aid organization. Our work with legislators and legislative advocacy is limited to opportunities where representatives request our input. Certainly we are happy to provide that when asked to do so, but in terms of broader education, that is a huge role that we are happy to continue playing, and definitely will be working collaboratively with this group and others to try to elevate the issue, as Erica talked about, and make sure people just understand the scale of this problem. It really does seem as though it had been kind of an invisible issue operating in a really detrimental way. So helping people to understand all of the ways it's playing out in individual lives is a big part of the work we'll continue to do. And I think Brian mentioned we're also trying to turn towards the court data. What we talked about today is just the BMV side of things. But there's a lot to be learned and understood about how this operates from the courts as well. So yes, we're still working on it.
Thank you.
Question over here.
I apologize. Maybe you're already going to talk about this, but I'm just thinking of the ripple effect, obviously, for voters, because if you don't have an ID, right? So I'm just curious how many of these millions of people assume that they can't vote because they know they don't have a driver's license and they've got to show an ID. So I'm just making a guess that maybe a lot of people think, I'm not even going to bother trying to vote because I don't have a driver's license anymore. And then, like in terms
crowd. I'm digging y'all, because I was literally about to say.
I figured you were going to talk about that. But in terms of telling stories, I'll just give you a tiny example to Joy's point. Like, my mom is elderly. She hasn't driven for a couple years, so we needed to transfer ownership of her car because we couldn't get insurance for it because she no longer was a licensed driver. So her insurance wouldn't, I would be willing to pay for it. It's a long story. So anyway, you go down this rabbit hole then because her driver's license was expired. We couldn't just get it renewed because she was in the hospital and all these things happened. So we went to try to get her, we had to get an ID because we had to get to transfer the deed to the car or whatever it's called, right? We couldn't do that without a notarized document. Nobody would notarize a document unless she had a valid ID, so we had to get a public ID. So And meanwhile, she's in a facility, right? So this took multiple visits of taking her back and forth to the DMV and being told different things, of course. But the bottom line is we needed a birth, she's 84. We needed a certified copy of the birth certificate. I had what looked like the original document, and they wouldn't take that because it didn't have the seal, right? So we go with that. Then I was thrilled that I had her social security card. We got a birth certificate. And then guess what? They wanted a marriage certificate because the name on her birth certificate is not the same on her social security card. But not only that, we needed the divorce, the original marriage certificate, because she got divorced in 1969 from my dad and got remarried in 70. Like, insanity. And part of the creepy thing about this is anybody can get your copy of these documents. My son was home from college, and I tasked him with running to all these places with my mom, thinking that she would have to be there, and she sat in the car, and they gave him all this stuff. So that's a little weird.
You brought up a whole lot, and we're supposed to be wrapping up this forum. So we're going to do our best to try to address some of these. One, many of these systems are not user-friendly, I'll say in the nicest possible way. Back in the day when I was doing more direct service with folks returning from incarceration, the running joke that was not a joke was that, obviously depending on how long somebody was incarcerated, if they no longer had access to their belongings and they needed to, get a new license or a new state ID, they couldn't get into City Hall because you need an ID to get in City Hall, or I have to get in City Hall because I need to get my birth certificate, right? So it's like just these barriers after barriers. What you're elevating is both disheartening and refreshing because your mom has you, right? And so having elderly parents, I've seen this new life cycle for our family and navigating different systems, and when you don't have, a support network, it is incredibly hard. It is incredibly hard to try to figure out how to access this information and the necessary documents that you need. So quickly on the voting, yes. And so thankfully, there was a story earlier this year from Washington Post that interviewed a number of folks here in Cleveland about the passage of, for those that are not familiar, HB 458. So this is legislation that passed at the end of 2022 that changed the voter ID requirements for all Ohioans across the state. And so one of those changes includes not being able to use an unexpired license, which was before an acceptable form of identification. There's many other things that are no longer allowed, but that's not what we're here today. But yes, the answer is, making sure that people are educated, which is clearly part of what Cleveland Votes and our partners do, is letting them know, it's important, incredibly important that you make a voter plan. And so if you are currently without valid ID, we highly encourage folks to vote early and or vote by mail, preferably vote by mail, because then you can use the last four of your Social Security number versus having to have a state ID or a driver's license. So again, the intersectionality with other challenges that folks are facing definitely is prevalent. Any other comments or responses from the panel before we start to wrap up? All right, well, I want to thank you all again for joining us now this evening as I see the sun setting outside the windows here. This has been such an educational forum. Every time I revisit this information, even as someone that reviewed the initial research, I continue to learn more. So I want to thank Zach, Joy, Brian, and Ann for bringing such a wealth of knowledge and insight today. If you can all join me in thanking them. As we promised, all contact information is here. Looking to the crowd to see, or to our friend, if the presentation will be shared with folks after. So yes, the presentation will be shared. So a tremendous amount of hyperlinks and information, obviously tons of quantitative data and graphs, so you'll have time to review that at your leisure. Zach, before we wrap up, did you want to talk about the Return to Road campaign? To the Road, excuse me.
Yeah, sure. So that's kind of what we're calling our legislative campaign around Senate Bill 37. There is a link in the slides that will get you to our campaign sign-on. So if you want to stay updated on the bill and how it's going, or if you want to get more involved and help support it, You can do so through that link or by talking to me after this presentation.
I want to thank each of you for joining us this evening. Again, the transfer of education and power. Now you have some information. You have to transfer that to someone in your support network, whether that's a neighbor or a friend. And I really encourage you to stay in contact with the folks here that were part of the conversation. So with that, we will close out and thank you again. It's right on time. Perfect timing.